Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Seed to Harvest. Super excited to have my friend Nikhil on today. Nikhil Krishnan is the founder of Out of Pocket, trying to make healthcare more accessible through memes, shit posts, and humor to explain it. They're building a newsletter, crash course, educational novelty products, including a game, a children's book, and more to help cut through the noise and explain plainly the business of healthcare and where the industry is headed. Nikhil previously did some stints at CV Insights and Trial Spark. He's also the one that inspired me to write Seed to Harvest, the children's book about VC, and has been super helpful on my journey. So I want to start out with, you write Out of Pocket, which started as a healthcare newsletter rife with memes. Can you share more about your writing and meming process and how has it changed as your audience has grown?
Yeah, well, I'm excited to be here in chats. Just from the other side of this, it's awesome to see what you've built from shit posting your way to glory also. Yeah, I mean, so, for some context, I was at a company called CV Insights for about 4.5 years and helped build out the healthcare research team there. And a big part of CB Insights was sort of writing these research reports and newsletters that were kind of snarky, sort of memey there. So that's really where I learned and kind of built the chops of like essentially trying to be informative shit posting.
Yeah,
Really,
like making a good meme.
you know, let
Do
me
you
tell you
have a
something.
process?
It's funny, like people always ask me this. They're like, "How do you make your
Tell me
memes
your
or
secrets.
whatever?" You just got to spend a lot of time on the internet. Like
Yeah,
I sometimes have to
extremely
like
online.
run. I have to run my memes sometimes like past my normie friends to make sure that like I'm not too kind of like brain diseased because my sense of humor is like so degenerate at this point that I like forget what normal people laugh at. But I actually have an entire folder on my phone of just like meme formats that I think are funny.
How
And
many
so
how many pictures are in that album, if you don't mind me
like
asking?
easily 600, maybe more.
600 photos of meme-ready things. And do you just
Yes.
read an article or see something and then go look for, like, a reaction photo?
Yeah, basically. It's
Is that
like
the
I have
vibe?
a
Okay.
concept in my head. I'm just gonna scroll through these meme
Where do you
formats.
find those, like, those source photos?
Damn, you're asking for my secret sauce.
I
What do people get
know.
me for if they find
This
this
is, like,
out?
more for my personal information because I feel like my memes have been subpar recently, and I would like to up my game, and I respect yours massively.
Listen, I follow like a lot of the meme accounts you probably know, ones that are like very business focused, for example, like your NBA Mikeys, your consulting humor type stuff.
Mhm.
But I also follow these like deep niche cut meme accounts that just like
Ooh,
post extremely deep fried things that make no sense, like grape juice boys and all that kind of
like,
like,
more, like, nihilistic ones?
yes,
Nice,
yes.
okay.
And then I'm
How do
also on
you
like a lot of subreddits, but yeah.
Yeah, how do you think your approach to being, like, a creator or writer has changed as your audience has grown? Have you seen any, like, significant shifts in that? Because for context, how many Twitter followers are you up to now? Let's see. I forgot to
I
check,
think it's like
ton.
42 or 43,000,
40
something like that.
yeah, 43.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting and it's something that I've talked with some other people who sort of write about. There's sort of like a bifurcation that has happened between, I would say, people that focus on the quality of their audience versus the people that focus on the number of people in their audience. And I think that actually is two very different approaches to how you think about building stuff like this. So even on
Mhm.
Twitter, right, like a lot of it has become way more algorithmic driven just by nature of the feed. And so as a result, you see things like people like doing threads and a lot of stuff that's sort of like algorithmic optimization,
I'm
which
shaking in my boots. I've written a
it's
lot of
just like,
threads.
I mean, you've seen it. Like I'm
Yeah, yeah,
preaching to the
yeah.
choir here. And then it's the same for newsletters, right? Where it's you can do a lot of things to grow your newsletter pretty fast if you don't
Mhm.
really care about the quality of subscribers, right?
Like what?
Um,
Oh, yeah, I guess it's like it's not as niche an audience. Well, I guess what I found was like I did a post like masterclass has the ad budget of Shen Yun and it got like, tens of millions of impressions and a bunch of new followers, but like
totally.
they kind of netted out to like nothing because they weren't really in my niche and they were just like, oh, she had like one banger tweet. And then I was like, do I have to keep writing these? Because I don't know how much left I have in my arsenal about like random pop culture things versus like a lot of people would be very disappointed when they find out I only tweet about venture.
Yeah, I think you are running into like the conundrum that a lot of people run into when they start writing stuff online, which is, do I care about branching to a wide audience or do I care about catering really well to a niche audience? And I don't think there's a right answer to this, but it's also two very different business models, right? If you are, trying to optimize for your ad load, for example, you're trying to increase
Right.
the number of
Impressions.
number
Yeah.
of things you write, number of impressions, number of eyeballs, all that kind of stuff. If you're trying to do other stuff, then actually you might care about the quality of audience. So like for me, for
Mm,
example, I have very explicitly focused on trying to have a high quality whatever, like, subscriber base, etcetera. And, the metric I'm probably most proud of is that the average open rate across all the newsletters is about 53%.
and it's been
Yeah,
going
and
for
so,
a
like
long time, which means that you have, like, subscribers that have been following you for, like, a long time and still opening. I feel like some newsletters that have been around for, like, shorter periods of time, I feel like your open rate really drops off after a while, so that's really impressive. Because 'Cause
yeah,
you've been running
naturally. I
for
mean,
at least 2 years
yeah, a little over
since when I
2
started
years
following
now.
you.
Yeah, a
Nice.
little over 2 years now. So it's,
So wait,
yeah.
I wanna talk about, like, the way that we originally met through Twitter was I feel like we were mutuals for a while, and then more specifically, you had a niche presentation night at Get Smart, which was really cool. Through the pandemic, you hosted these really interesting conversations. I did a presentation on spatial audio, kind of tied into, like, my senior thesis around how Shazam works, and it ended up leading to me meeting one of my investors in both Fund 1 and Fund 2, which is super cool. So I'm curious what led you to start that initiative, and then are there any other cool connection stories that you've heard of that have come out of that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Originally when I left my job 2 years ago, I was planning to start a very different company, which was not healthcare related at all. The premise was about me helping people meet offline after having like an online sort of whatever rapport. And I had this newsletter that I used to write before, which was it's called Get Real. I used to ask a question each week. People would respond with their answers. I would post my favorites the next week, etc. And the idea was to actually have like these sort of more thoughtful social networks that monetize through events. And the first event that I threw was called Get Smart, and it was these in-person TED Talk style events, and I, did about 8 of them in person before the pandemic, and probably like 150 or so people were coming to them. So obviously there was like touching some nerve for people. And then through pandemic, wanted to like do virtual versions of it and keep it up. Obviously, I ended up not pursuing that company for obvious reasons, but the goal of it was really just one, like, how do you make it easier for people to meet in these like semi-structured environments of some kind? And two, it's just like people have these really niche interests that I just think are cool.
Do you remember some of the examples? I remember the one that I, like, most remembered was, like, the origins of alcohol, which was really interesting. It goes into, like, what different organic materials are, like, every alcohol made
Yeah,
out
yeah.
of and, like, how they differ across cultures. There's some other really cool ones. Do you
There's
have any other
so many.
topics you remember?
Yeah, I mean, like, one of my friends, like, formerly was in Scientology and gave a whole talk about
Whoa.
like, being in Scientology. One friend did a whole talk on the history of animation, another person did one on the economics of Chinese restaurants. Like, you're talking, like,
Whoa.
the whole gamut here. It's, like,
Yeah.
very weird stuff and,
It's so fun
niche.
too. It also, like, unlocked something in me where I was like, "Oh, I can talk about my interests that are, like, super niche and I, like, know a lot about." Like, right now I'm reading this crazy, like, it's written in 1901, but it's like a treatise on, like, libraries and the architecture of libraries and, like, all these random manual machines that they used to have for, like, displaying and reading and doing stuff, but it's really interesting. I was like, "Oh, damn. I wanna do another gotta do another niche presentation night again." It's been too long.
Yeah, for a lot of people, I think it's a good way to sort of force themselves to, like, get these, like, weird amorphous thoughts they have in their
Yeah.
head down on
Yeah, you're
paper,
like, "Hey,
right?
Paige, are you ready?" And I was like,
Yeah.
No. No, I'm
Well, too
not."
bad.
And you were like, "Yeah, it's tomorrow, so, like, get going." So
You
it's
got
kinda nice to
this.
have that forcing function.
And it's, like, small, the whole point is,
Yeah.
like, you can practice your public speaking in a way that's not, like, crazy large or, like, high
Yeah.
stakes, so
So if you're hosting a dinner party, who would be your dream guest? They can be historical or present, friends or public figures, and then what would you serve and where would it be?
oh my god. This is, like, 3 separate, very difficult questions combined into one.
Yeah, I'm gonna put you on the
Um,
spot.
that's hard. I think the people that I'm most interested in are, like, how did people manage to convince large groups of followings to, like, believe in them, right? Just, like, as a broad thematic cover.
Only
And
extremely online Twitter people.
But this is like the thing is like the modern whatever person who has managed to build a following has like very different traits and characteristics, or maybe not. Maybe it's very similar to like people who managed to build followings in the past, right? So like if
Mm,
you take like the Jesuses of the world or like the, Gandhis of the world. Like they managed to rally people underneath
Wow.
something that they were, kind of getting that like touched the populace. So, one is just like, how did they manage to do that? And also, I mean, I have like a weird, like, side interest in just religious texts broadly. I just think it's like the perfect intersection of like history, sociology, whatever, and it kind of shapes the entire modern world. I think like all the like old school religious figures would be most interesting, and then I guess you got to pick like a neutral place to have dinner in that case. So no meats or anything like that. So maybe Italian. You can go to Lilia. Maybe that could finally get a reservation if Jesus came with me. Just kidding.
I love that. So I've been really inspired by your playfulness in developing both your content and the merch that goes with it, including a children's book and a game. Actually, like the original idea for Seed to Harvest came because you announced your book and then I quote tweeted and I was like, would anyone be interested in reading a children's book about VC? And then I got like 80 DMs and I was like, I'm writing a children's book about VC. And then you had written all about your process. So I'm curious. I learned a lot about the process of self-publishing a book, but what was the process like for developing the game? You have a really great blog post that I'll link in the show notes, but if you want to talk about it a bit, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so the purpose of me doing the game was actually sort of trying to teach myself like how e-commerce worked very broadly.
Mhm.
So, as you probably found out for the book, because Amazon has its own self-publishing press, it's very easy to handle the manufacturing side of this thing. But I was actually very curious, like what happens when you add the third party to the mix, which is the manufacturer. And so I made a card game that's basically you have to avoid medical bankruptcy, and it's a lot of people spend a lot of time on figuring out gameplay mechanics when they figure out board games. I did not do that. I like reskinned some games that are like pretty well known. I just like modified the rules very
Oh.
slightly.
Yeah, because they've
So
already spent money on like game mechanics, design, and stuff like
yeah,
that.
and also it's like the point of this is not to like teach people like it's already gonna be
Like a
complicated enough
crazy
when they have to
detailed
read the
game.
yeah, it's gonna be hard enough when they have to read the like healthcare text on this. Like I don't need to like make it more difficult for them. But I was interested in doing actually I was examining a few different board game types. And the thing that is the constraint point is the more pieces that you have in the game, the more expensive it is, which is like not rocket
Mm.
science to figure out. But now I'm like hyper aware every time I play a board game of like how many units are there because I'm like, oh my god, like unit costs for this must be
You gotta do
insane.
a talk on like the economic support games now.
I did this at the last Get Smart, actually. So the funny thing about doing this also was it was during like a lot of the supply chain crisis, so I could actually
Mhm.
see in real time how a lot of this was getting impacted because you're making choices between manufacturing domestically versus in China for the most part, and the prices are just like astronomically different depending on how many you're printing, what the shipping costs at the time were, etc. And then you got to figure out how do I get it to like the Amazon warehouses. Learned all about that. Being like an Amazon purchaser versus a seller is like drastically
Totally
different.
different worlds,
Like
yeah. Uh,
completely. Now I understand how like Amazon gets like squeezes its suppliers like crazy being on the supplier side versus me as a consumer being like, wow, what a fantastic
This is
and convenient
amazing.
service. Yeah, like, oh my God, no, this is like brutal for small businesses. So
Yeah. Even with, like, the print on demand, it's been interesting because it's like they just don't ship to certain countries. Like, it was like, "Oh, yeah, we don't ship to Australia," and I was like, "Okay, like, I'll handle that later," and then I went to Australia, and I met with a bunch of startup people there, and they're like, "So, you wrote this book, but we can't buy it in Australia. Like, can you ship it to us?" And I was like, "Amazon, like, come on, get it together." Like, ugh.
yeah, I get this all the time for other countries, and I don't know what to do. Am I gonna really like buy like pre-print like 500 copies and just store them in a random warehouse in one of these countries? Like
I mean, that's
realistically,
been,
probably
like,
not.
the best answer for me so far, so hoping Amazon comes up with a different different one for that. So I'm curious, like, in your research, what is the one problem in healthcare that irritates or confuses you the most?
Oh my God, this is gonna be a whole podcast. No, I'm kidding. I mean, there's lots of stuff. Obviously, I think the one that's most frustrating is kind of we have like an employer-based health insurance system here. It's a
Mm,
very uniquely U.S. quirk. In post World War II, it was essentially something the government kind of gave us like a little side benefit to employers, and they were like, "Look, you have to freeze wages because we don't want a crazy amount of inflation, but you can use your these tax-free dollars on other things for employees." And
Oh,
one of those things was health insurance. And so this didn't really
what?
matter at the time because health insurance was like such a tiny, tiny cost,
Yeah.
but it became a huge problem later down the road as healthcare got more complicated, expensive, and all this kind of stuff.
These were like tax incentivized because it was tax free. Is that right?
Yeah, basically, the if your employer picks the health insurance plan, they can move tax-free dollars towards it, versus
Whoa.
if me or you buy a health insurance plan, it is post-tax dollars, right? Because it's coming out of our income. And that just creates like a whole level of warped incentives. Everything from your HR manager is suddenly in charge of healthcare benefits, even though they have no expertise evaluating like the efficacy of any healthcare company. Benefits in general are tied to your employer. So if you switch employers, you automatically churn from any company that you're using, any service you're using. I'm sure like if you've like switched, anyone listening has switched between employers, it's like a hilarious ritual of like join company, ask HR like what plan should they pick? Find a new primary care physician. Just kind of like
Yeah.
ask your
No,
coworkers like, hey, does anyone like see a PCP in network? And it's like,
I'm still on my dad's health insurance. Shout out dad. And
shout
because
out
I'm like under
Obamacare.
26. Yeah. Shout out
Yeah,
Obamacare. But he recently switched jobs and well, okay, not recently, like October, but I haven't been able to like get a new primary care physician because the wait has been so long to switch doctors. So
exactly.
yeah, very for
Like
that ritual.
exactly. And it's just so much of this is born out of that one specific problem. And, it gets worse over time, I think, as the government sort of social, like the social safety net erodes a little bit. I mean, you can even, even looking at things like Roe v. Wade, for example, if
Yeah.
employers
Now
start
it's like
leaning into
those
abortion
benefits are
access
provided
as a
by the
benefit.
employers, especially in like
Yeah.
a
Like,
continuously tumultuous market. That seems like very challenging.
yeah, exactly. It's like you don't want to get laid off from your job and suddenly not have access to something like abortion care because your employer is the only person that offers it. That's not how we should like be operating as a society, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely like very disappointing. It's definitely cool to see companies stepping up, but it just, yeah, that one little addition in World War II.
It's and like the crazy part is actually if you look at other countries in like a post World War II, they went in basically the totally opposite direction. So if you look at like the UK, for example, it was the total opposite. They were like, you know, the war had decimated the economy. The government was basically like, we need to just run this shit ourselves.
Yeah.
And they, essentially out of that came out with the NHS, which they fund and operate themselves. So, there
Whoa.
are other paths that can come out of it. We just chose one specific one. And now the ramifications of that are very weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So, on a lighter note, when you were like early days of being an extremely online person, I know I have this, but like you probably have like extreme ambient knowledge of like random online communities. Who did you look up to when you like first started doing Twitter stuff slash being extremely online?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the people who really I thought were so interesting were like the Ben Thompsons and Matt Levines of the world, which
Hmm.
is this is probably like a common answer now, but I was just impressed with one, how they were managing to make such interesting for Matt Levine in particular is just the funniest people writing on the internet and writes a finance column for Bloomberg and takes a topic that like I don't really give a shit about, to be totally honest. Like I don't find finance that interesting, but he writes about it so like in such a fun way that
Hmm.
it's just entertaining to read. And so that's definitely like one of the people who I just was looking up to as a person like, wow, he managed to make this very boring subject actually pretty entertaining and easy to read. I actually, it's funny, my like first like being very online experience was actually like pre being on Twitter or anything. I was in high school and I used to be like a frequenter of the Nike SB forums because I
Hmm.
used to sell custom sneakers
Oh, yeah,
that
you're a
I would make.
sneakerhead. I didn't know that. That's
I
dope.
was a sneakerhead, yes. And so
Still?
not really, honestly. It's just it's not a good investment anymore. But
No.
I used to like paint sneakers and sell them basically online in these Nike SB forums, and there were all these like moderators and like really respected people in these forums that were just very cool, and I would like DM them sometimes. And so it's actually very funny to see this kind of come full circle again today with DAOs and stuff like that, because sort of like similar vibes. You go into some of
Similar
these
vibes,
DAOs and
yeah.
you're
Well,
like
I
they
was
look
like
like a
part of
forum.
were you part of iMouth I? I know you're like, I remember you being extremely online during that point and tweeting about it, but
Yeah,
I didn't
yeah.
remember if
I'm
you were
like
in it.
again, like all of this stuff, I'm like the boomer observer for most of these things. I
I remember
wasn't
that
part
was
of it,
like
but I watched.
yeah, that was like my first extremely online moment. And I feel like the alumni network that's come out of that is like actually insane. Like everyone is just like so extremely online and it had experienced like this massive like virality and action as a impact of it. So it was interesting to see like I was like, oh, online actions can have like really significant impacts or consequences, which was kind of cool to see that in like a very
100%.
positive way.
I have
Yeah.
like a sort of a little bit of like a philosophy around a lot of the stuff, which is, the first wave of the internet, I think, has sort of been focused on like getting a high volume of like followers or people that you talk with. And this kind of like relates back to the newsletter stuff we were talking about earlier. I am a big believer in like self selection as a process, which is if you set up enough hoops or like whatever, set up enough roadblocks for people and they come through the other side of it, you get like a very specific type of person that's shaped by the like obstacles that you put in front of them. So
Mm.
for example, if you think about like the iMouth I thing, right? Like the first people who probably started that are probably like just super interested in some weird internet culture stuff and like just very it's a specific archetype of person, right? That you might vibe with or not. Or for example, for my newsletter, the people who are on my newsletter like enjoy reading long form, very unprofessional healthcare content. So if you read that and you're responding thoughtfully to that, etc., like 99% chance that we'll probably get along. And so I think what's sort of happening now is you're seeing more of these like self-selection processes get built out so that the people who are like the right vibe for whatever community or audience or whatever you want to call it make it through to the end rather than trying to get the largest audience possible. And I think that's sort of changing.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about like the hoops that you have to jump through and also like thinking about the different ways that you as a creator like start to understand and interact with the algorithm in that way where I was like, okay, like you have to kind of have a ratio of like shit posts, like informative things, because you have to have a blend of like having a top of funnel and then having your like actual like meaty content that you enjoy writing, but might not have like as vast of a impression impact, but it is like what you're really excited about. And then you have like your random things that you dash off in 5 seconds that like
Yeah.
randomly go viral and you're like, oh, hello, new friends.
Yeah, I think like when people think about the funnel, they've always focused on the top of the funnel rather than like how do you convert the middle at a higher rate?
Hmm.
And if you convert the middle at a higher rate, you don't need a bigger top of funnel, right? So even if your stuff is more niche, if the people go through it at a higher conversion rate, then it worked the same, right? If not better, because it's probably like a easier audience to target. So I don't know,
Mm,
same self-selection sort of process, but you get it.
yeah, that's super interesting. Okay, so I know we're wrapping up, but I want to ask you one more question. When you think about your legacy, what are the things that are most important to you?
God. I wonder what my legacy is actually going to be. Someone's going to like read my eulogy and it's going to be like, yo, this dude sucked. I mean, I think it's a couple things, right? Like, I think one from like a more specific, like professional output stuff, I want people to like not feel like they need to be professional to get their point across. I want like being casual and having open conversations about what is like probably generally boring or professional, like pseudo professional topics to be more normalized. And generally, I would love to like get people excited about building stuff in healthcare, which is like traditionally just been a very boring and intimidating place for people to start. And then on a personal note, I want people to like feel that they don't have to pick like very traditional career trajectories to feel like their voice can be like respected in a specific field. Like I don't have traditional healthcare background at all,
Yeah,
right?
I never took a
I just like
finance class.
yeah, like you just read a lot and talk to people and figure stuff out and play around with new tools or whatever you want to call it, and like you could build your credibility without needing to like go to a master's program or get like the stamp of approval from someone else just to like get your name out there. So my hope is that, the idea of credibility changes, and at least in healthcare where this is like a huge issue, like there's a lot of gatekeeping that happens, like credibility without degrees. I'm trying to change that a little bit. So
Yeah,
we'll
I
see.
love that. Well, it was fantastic having you on. I so enjoyed our conversation from
Yeah.
shitposting to legacies to dinner parties with religious figures. Where can people find you on the internet if they want to learn more? I'll link some
Oh
stuff in the
man.
show notes as well, but
I'm
what's your Twitter
very easy
handle?
to find on the internet. I am on Twitter on at Nikhil and I, and you can look at my healthcare stuff on my website, outofpocket.health. Come hang out. I'll teach you about
Perfect.
healthcare.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thanks,
And
Paige.
yeah. Thanks so much for tuning in today to Seed to Harvest. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever your favorite podcast listening platform is. I'll be releasing new episodes weekly, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know on Twitter. That's Paige Finn, Paige and then Finn with 3 N's. Thanks, and see you again next week.